The morning Callum stopped speaking was the same morning the fox appeared at the edge of the field behind their house, sitting perfectly still in the frost, watching him through the kitchen window as if it had been waiting there all night. He was 9 years old. He had not said a word to his father in 4 days, and when Rowan came downstairs that Tuesday and found his son standing at the glass with both hands pressed flat against it, breath fogging the pane, staring out at something Rohan couldn't immediately see. Something in the air of that kitchen shifted in a way that Rohan would spend years afterward trying to describe and never quite manage. He followed the line of his son's gaze. And then he saw it. A fox, amber and rust, unusually still, sitting about 30 meters from the house at the exact boundary where the grass ended and the dark tree line of the cairn forest began. Its eyes, even from that distance, were visible and fixed, and they were fixed on Callum. Rowan told him to come away from the window and eat his breakfast. Callum didn't move. That should have been the beginning of a very ordinary week in a very quiet village. It was not. What happened over the next 11 days in Ashfeld would eventually be examined by a wildlife researcher, a structural engineer, a local historian, and a woman who had not spoken the name of that village aloud in 31 years. None of them, in the end, could account for all of it. And the part that none of them could account for was the part that started with a 9-year-old boy and a fox who kept returning, day after day, to the edge of that field, as if it was delivering an invitation. The part no one could explain was where the invitation led. Ashfeld sits in the eastern reach of a valley that most people in that part of Scotland have learned to navigate around rather than through. The road into it is single track and poorly signed, the kind of road that convinces you you've made a wrong turn twice before you arrive. There are 43 permanent residents, 1 shop, a church that holds services twice a month because the minister drives from another parish, and to the northwest, largely invisible beneath decades of ivy and birch overgrowth, the remains of Carrath Castle, abandoned since 1962 and owned, technically, by an estate trust that had not responded to a letter in 11 years. No one in Ashfeld went to Carrath Castle. This was not a rule anyone had written down. It was simply understood, in the way that certain things in small places become understood without being said, that the castle was not a place for the living anymore. The children of Ashfeld grew up with this understanding, the way they grew up, knowing not to walk on the ice of the loch before February. You simply did not go to Carrath. Callum had never been told this directly. His father had brought him to Ashfeld only 14 months earlier, when Rowan's back injury ended his contract with the Forestry Commission, and a friend offered them the use of a cottage at low rent while Rohan recovered and figured out what came next. They were outsiders. Nobody had thought to explain the castle to them. Nobody had thought to, because nobody had thought it would matter. Callum had not been a difficult child before Ashfeld. His teachers in Glasgow had described him as curious, unusually observant, the kind of boy who noticed things adults walked past. He had his father's quietness, a stillness that could be mistaken for shyness, but was in fact something closer to attention. He was paying attention constantly. He simply chose carefully what to do with what he noticed. After they moved to Ashfeld, the quietness deepened. His father noticed it, but said nothing, because his own quietness had deepened too. And he understood that grief did not ask permission before it found new shapes in new places. Callum's mother, Mira, had died 22 months before the move. She had been a woman who laughed with her whole body and loved the outdoors and had a habit of collecting small, unusual stones from everywhere she went and lining them up on windowsills. The cottage in Ashfeld had windowsills everywhere. Rowan had noticed this on their first day and had not mentioned it to Callum, who had also noticed and had also said nothing. This is the thing about people who pay attention. They carry what they notice silently, like stones in their pockets, and sometimes the weight of it accumulates without anyone seeing. The fox came back the next morning. Callum was up before his father, which had become his habit, and when Rowan came downstairs at 6:30, he found the back door open and a cold November draft moving through the kitchen, and Callum standing outside in his socks and pajamas at the edge of the grass, and the fox sitting exactly where it had been the morning before, watching him. Rowan called his son's name. Callum turned and came inside without argument, but his eyes stayed on the tree line until the door closed between them. He ate breakfast without speaking. He went to school without speaking. He came home and went directly to his room, and when Rowan knocked and looked in, Callum was sitting at his desk, drawing something in the notebook he'd had since Glasgow, the one with the green cover that had originally been for school, but had long since become something else. Rohan asked what he was drawing. Callum turned the notebook so his father could see. It was the fox, rendered in pencil. Smaller than life, but with an accuracy of detail that made Rohan stand in the doorway longer than he'd intended. The ears slightly asymmetrical. One paw lifted, and the ales, which even in pencil had something in them that Rowan couldn't name and didn't want to try to name at 7 o'clock on a Tuesday evening, after a day of his back, reminding him. It was not healed, and might not be. He told Callum dinner would be ready in half an hour, and pulled the door closed. He stood in the hallway, for a moment he could not account for. The fox came back the third morning, and the fourth, and on the fifth morning, Callum was out the door before Rohan was awake. And when Rowan found him, 30 minutes later, Callum was standing at the tree line itself, 3 meters from the fox, who had not run. Rowan crossed the field at a pace that was not quite running. He reached his son and put a hand on his shoulder and said the boy's name. And Callum turned and looked at him with an expression that Rohan could not read, which was unusual, because Rohan had always been able to read his son's face. The fox watched them both for a moment with that same unsettling stillness. Then it turned and walked into the trees. Not quickly. Not afraid, the way something walks when it knows where it is going and expects to be followed. Callum took one step after it. Rowan's hand tightened on his shoulder. Callum stopped, but he didn't look back at his father. He kept his eyes on the point in the trees where the fox had disappeared, and then he said, for the first time in 5 days, a single word. He said, please. Rohan would replay that word for a long time afterward. The sound of it? Not a child's plea, not frustration, not the ordinary want of something ordinary. It was the kind of pleas that comes from somewhere deeper than wanting, the kind that arrives when a person understands that something important is at stake and has no other language for it yet. He said no. He brought Callum inside. He made breakfast and watched his son eat in silence, and drove him to school and came back to the cottage and stood at the kitchen window for 20 minutes staring at the tree line where the fox had gone. He told himself it was just a fox, that Callum was lonely and had attached a meaning to a coincidence, that he was 9 and imaginative and had lost his mother less than 2 years ago, and sometimes grief pulled the mind toward things that felt significant because the mind needed significance and could not always find it in ordinary places. He told himself all of this very clearly and very rationally. And then the fox appeared at the edge of the grass again in full daylight and looked at Rohan through the kitchen window with the same fixed attention it had given Callum. And Rowan set his coffee mug down with a care he was not conscious of and did not move for a long time. He would not tell anyone about that part. On the 6th day, Callum asked his father a question at dinner. He asked if his father had ever heard of Carrath Castle. Rohan had not. C-E-6. Callum nodded slowly, the way he nodded when he was processing something he had already known the answer to. He said that the woman at the village shop, Mrs. Fernie, had told him to stay away from it when he'd asked her where it was. He said she'd looked strange when he asked. He said the fox came from the direction of it every morning and went back the same way every time, and he thought that was where it was trying to take him. Rohan put down his fork. He looked at his son across the table. He asked how Callum knew which direction the castle was in. Callum said he'd looked it up. He said that a girl had gone missing near Carrath Castle in 1991. He said her name was Fenavale. He said she was 10 years old and they never found her and the case was still technically open. He said he didn't know why, but he thought the fox knew something about it. The silence in that kitchen was not like the ordinary silences of their evenings. It was a different quality of quiet altogether. Rowan said he needed Callum to hear him very clearly. He said the castle was off limits. He said missing person cases were for the police, not for He said he understood that Callum was curious and that he was bored and that Ashfeld was not Glasgow, but that this was not a thing he was going to discuss further. Callum listened to all of this without moving. Then he looked at his father with that unreadable expression again, and said one more thing before he asked to be excused. He said that Fenavale would have been 40 years old this year. He said that was the same age his mother would have been. He said he didn't think that was a coincidence. And then he asked to be excused, and carried his plate to the sink, and went upstairs. And Rohan sat at that table for a long time after, with a feeling he did not have a name for moving through him like cold water. He did not sleep that night. Not because of the castle, not because of the missing girl, not really. He lay in the dark and thought about Mira, and the way she used to trace her fingers along windowsills, the same way she traced the edges of maps, like she was memorizing the shape of places, like she was afraid they might shift while she wasn't watching. He thought about the stones on the windowsills she never got to see. He thought about the particular cruelty of bringing a child to a place that looked like somewhere his mother would have loved. He thought about the photograph in the box in the top of his wardrobe, the one he hadn't looked at since they moved. He thought about it for a long time, without quite understanding why. Outside, in the direction of the cairn forest, in the deep dark of that November night, something moved through the trees, with a sound too deliberate to be wind. On the 7th morning, Callum was gone. Rowan woke at 5:30, which was earlier than usual, pulled from sleep by something he could not identify, and lay still for a moment, listening to the particular quality of the house's quiet before he understood that the quiet was wrong. He got up and went to Callum's room. The bed had been slept in. The green notebook was gone. The bite, though, when he got to the kitchen, was not latched properly, the way it looked when someone had closed it carefully from outside. He was across the field in 30 seconds, into the tree line in 45. He called Callum's name. The forest received the sound and gave nothing back. The cairn forest is not a forest that rewards panic. It is old growth interrupted by commercial planting, a patchwork of ancient Scots pine and dense Sitka spruce that closes around a person with an intimacy that feels like pressure. In November, in the Predon dark, with the ground still frozen in places and the branches above shedding what was left of their frost, it was not a place for a man in bare feet to run without direction. Rohan ran without direction. He ran for 3 minutes before he stopped himself, breathing hard, back seizing at the impact of uneven ground, and made himself stand still and think. He tried to remember what Callum had said. The fox came from the northwest. The castle was to the northwest. A forestry track ran northwest from behind the cottage, a track he had walked twice in the weeks after they arrived, an old timber road that had been a real road once, compacted earth and fieldstone that went deeper into the forest than the newer tracks. He had not gone to the end of it. He stood in the dark for a moment, listening. He could not hear his son. He could not hear anything except the trees adjusting to the cold and the sound of his own breathing, and somewhere above him, something that might have been a bird, but arrived with a deliberateness that birds do not usually have before first light. He thought about the 5 days of silence. He thought about the pleas. He thought about how in 11 years of knowing Mira, she had once told him that the woods outside of cities felt different from the woods inside of them, that they held things, information, accumulation, layers of what had happened in them over time, and that a person who was quiet enough could feel this. He had told her, gently, that this was not scientifically supportable. She had smiled at him the way she smiled when she thought he was missing the point on purpose. He started walking. He found Callum 14 minutes later. He found him at the edge of a clearing he had not known was there, standing at the boundary of what had once been the castle's outer wall, now reduced in most places to a low ridge of Muscoverde stone, but still traceable, still defining a perimeter. The castle itself rose beyond it, roofless in several sections, the towers at different heights of ruin, the stones so dark with moisture and age that it seemed not to be built from the landscape but grown from it. Birch trees had taken root in the upper floors. The whole structure breathed with moss. Callum was standing at the broken gatehouse, with the fox at his side, not near him. At his side, their proximity was close enough that the fox's tail was brushing against Callum's ankle as it moved. And the fox was not still anymore. It was moving in a tight, focused pattern along the base of the gatehouse wall, back and forth, its nose close to the stone. with the specific intensity of something that has found what it was looking for and is waiting for someone else to understand. Rohan stopped walking. He stood at the edge of the clearing and looked at his son and the animal beside him and the castle beyond them both. And something happened in his chest that he had not felt since the days immediately after Myra died. A kind of fracturing behind the sternum that was not quite pain and not quite grief, but was in the same family as both. He said Callum's name very quietly. Callum turned. His face, in the gray pre-dawn light, was calm in a way that had nothing to do with peace and everything to do with certainty. The certainty of a person who has been trying to tell you something important for a long time and has finally managed to bring you to the place where you can see it for yourself. He pointed at the base of the wall where the fox was moving. Sai Anluk. At the base of the gatehouse wall, in a section where the stones had shifted over decades and left a gap between the foundation course and the ground, someone had pushed something through. Not recently. The object was dark with age and moisture, wrapped in what had once been oilcloth, now deteriorated to a stiff and mottled gray-brown that had somehow, impossibly, held. The package was approximately the size of a hardback book, maybe smaller. Rohan crouched down. He looked at it for a moment without touching it. The stone around the gap was undisturbed. No recent marks. The gap itself was not something you would find by casual inspection. It was at ground level, partly concealed behind a growth of heart's tongue fern that had established itself over years, its fronds winter pale and flattened by frost. To find it, you would need to already be looking at that specific section of wall. To know to look at that specific section of wall, you would need to have been told, or to have been led. The fox sat down and watched him. He reached in and took the package out. It took him several minutes to unwrap it. The oilcloth was not so much sealed as compressed by time, layers that peeled apart in the cold morning air with a resistance that felt like reluctance. What was inside was not a book. It was a collection of items wrapped together, a folded piece of paper, still mostly intact, a small length of red cord, knotted in a pattern he didn't recognize, a child's drawing, done in wax crayon on card that had gone soft and blurred at the edges but was still legible. The drawing showed a fox, amber and rust, sitting in a field at the edge of a tree line. Rowan looked at the drawing. He looked at the fox. He looked at his son. Callum had gone very still. The drawing had a name on the back, written in the careful block letters of a child practicing their handwriting. The name was Fenna. The folded paper, when Rowan opened it with hands that were not entirely steady, was a letter written in the handwriting of a child of perhaps 10, a child who had come to this place alone and left something behind. Because she had understood, in the way that children sometimes understand things before adults will allow themselves to, that she needed to leave something behind. The letter was short. It said, "I found the fox by the north wall 3 days ago. She has a hurt leg. I have been bringing her food from the kitchen. I think she trusts me now. I am going to come back tomorrow. If anyone finds this, the fox's den is behind the fallen section of the east tower. She had pups in the spring. I think one of them is still there. I am going to come back and check. My name is Fenna. I am 10. Please take care of her if something happens and I don't come back." The last 4 words. "If I don't come back." Rowan read the letter twice. Then he folded it very carefully and held it in his hands and looked at the fox, who was sitting with that same quality of stillness, and looked at the drawing of the fox that looked exactly like this fox, and held both things in his mind at the same time without trying to explain them, because there was no explanation that felt adequate to the moment, and maybe that was all right. He thought about what Callum had said. Fenna Vale would have been 40 years old this year. He thought about the photograph in the box in the top of his wardrobe. He sat down on the cold stone of the gatehouse and looked at his son and said, "How did you know?" Callum sat down beside him. He was quiet for a moment, in the way he was quiet when he was choosing words. He said, "She kept coming back. Every day, to the same place. To the same window. I thought maybe she was looking for someone who wasn't there anymore." He paused. He said, "I understood that." The sky was beginning to gray at the edges. The forest around the clearing made a sound all at once. Not wind exactly, but the collective adjustment of trees to the approaching light. A sound that, in a different state of mind, you might call a sigh. Rohan put his arm around his son and held him, and Callum let him, and neither of them said anything for a while. What happened next took weeks to unfold, as these things do, because the world runs on procedures that do not accommodate wonder very well and have no category for what that clearing held that morning. Rowan called the local police when they got back to the cottage. He was careful about what he said because he didn't fully understand what he had to say, but he mentioned the missing person case, the name Finavel, the package at the gatehouse wall. The constable he spoke to was a man named Struan, who had been in Ashfeld for 20 years, and he went very quiet on the phone when Rohan said the name. He said he'd come by that afternoon. He came by that afternoon, and he read the letter, and he looked at the drawing, and he did not speak for a long time. Then he said that Fenna Vale had been reported missing on a Tuesday in November 1991. The last person to see her was Mrs. Fernie's mother, who had seen her walking toward the north edge of the village with something under her arm, heading in the direction of the forest. The case had never been formally closed because a body had never been found, which meant that Fina had simply ceased to exist in the public record in the quiet, undramatic way that unsolved disappearances eventually do when no one powerful enough to keep asking questions keeps asking them. Struan said that Fenna had no living family in Ashfeld. Her parents had left the year after her disappearance and eventually moved abroad. Her mother had died in 2019. Her father was believed to be in Portugal. He said that Fina had been known in the village as a girl who spent a lot of time in the forest. He said she had brought home injured animals. He said the Fernies, who had known her family well, had never talked about her directly, not in Struan's memory, and that he had understood this as grief of the particular kind that closes over itself. Like water and leaves, no surface indication of what is underneath. He looked at Callum when he said all of this. Callum listened without expression. Struan asked if he could take the letter and the drawing as part of the case record. Rohan said yes. Struan wrapped them back in the remains of the oilcloth and put them in his jacket pocket with a care that was not procedural. Before he left, he said something that Rohan would repeat later and not know exactly why it stayed with him. He said that in 31 years of people not going to Carrath Castle, in 31 years of the village understanding, without being told that the castle was a place for grief and not for the living, the fox was the first creature in all that time that anyone had reported seeing come out of those woods and cross into the village to find someone. He said, "I don't know what to make of that." He said it the way a man says something when he actually does know what to make of it, but has spent enough years being professional that the professional reflex fires first. He left. The door closed. The cottage was quiet. 3 days after Struan's visit, Mrs. Fernie came to the cottage. She knocked at the door on a Thursday afternoon when Callum was at school and Rohan was doing the occupational therapy exercises that his back required, and that he had consistently failed to do with the regularity the therapist recommended. He opened the door and she was standing there with a tin that contained, as he would discover, a shortbread she had made that morning, and an expression on her face that had several layers to it, none of them simple. She was a woman in her mids, stout and precise in the way of people, who have kept a shop for decades and understand that the world functions best when things are where they are supposed to be. She had lived in Ashfeld her entire life. She had been in her mid-30s when Fennavel disappeared. She sat at Rowan's kitchen table and accepted a cup of tea and held it with both hands, and for a moment said nothing, which he had the good sense not to interrupt. She said that Fenna's family had been in Ashfeld for 6 years before it happened. She said Fenna's mother, whose name was Anne's, had been the closest thing she'd had to a real friend in the village, the kind of friendship where you don't need to explain yourself because you are already understood. She said after Fenna went missing and the police came and the weeks passed and nothing was found, Anne's had changed in the way that you change when something breaks inside you that was load-bearing, and the Vales had left Ashfeld the following spring, and she had received one letter from Anne's from Rotterdam and then nothing, and she had understood that some silences are not waiting to be broken. She said she had never stopped expecting Fenna to come around the corner of the shop the way she used to, running ahead of her mother with that particular energy of a child who had somewhere to be and had already been patient long enough getting there. She said, "I don't know what your boy found. I don't know what that fox is or isn't. I stopped needing to know that a long time ago." She paused. She said, "But I want you to know that she was a good girl. She was the kind of child who made you feel, when she looked at you, that she actually saw you, not your age or your shop or your role. Just you." She finished her tea. She took the tin back because it was her good tin and she needed it. She left without ceremony, which was the only way Mrs. Fernie ever left anywhere. Rowan stood in the kitchen after she had gone and looked at the table where she had sat, and thought about what it meant to be the kind of person who actually sees you, and thought about whether that was a capacity that could be passed down, not through blood, but through something else, through the places where certain people had been before you and left something of themselves in the air. He thought about his son outside with the fox every evening. He thought about Callum drawing things he had never been taught to draw. He thought about the green notebook and what was in it and what Callum was adding to it, night after night, at his desk, in the lamplight, with the quiet attention of someone who is documenting something important before it can be forgotten again. Rohan said yes. He watched through the kitchen window as his son crossed the field and stood at the tree line, and the fox came out of the trees and sat beside him for a long time without either of them moving. And the light failed around them both slowly, in the way the light in November fails in Scotland, with a patience that has nothing apologetic about it. A May dinner. He called Callum in when it was ready. He thought about the photograph. After dinner, he went upstairs and opened the box in the wardrobe and found the photograph at the bottom where he had placed it, without looking at it when they'd packed to leave Glasgow. He stood in the bedroom and looked at it in the lamplight. It was a photograph of Mira. Before she was his, before she was Callum's mother, before she was any of the things she had become. She was in this photograph young enough that he had always dated it as a year or two before they met, which would make it late 1991 or early 1992. She was standing at the edge of a forest, or what appeared to be a forest, Airback half turned to the camera, looking at something in the trees. She had brought this photograph with her everywhere for the duration of their relationship, and when he had asked her once where it was taken, she had said she didn't exactly remember. A village somewhere north. She had visited as a child with her parents. She had never mentioned it again. He had found it among her things after she died and had not known what to do with it and had put it in a box. He looked at the photograph for a long time. He looked at the tree line in the background of it, the particular shape of the trees. The way the light fell, the ridge of stone visible at the left edge of the frame, Lowen Morskoved. He sat down on the edge of the bed. He thought about Callum saying that Fina would have been 40 this year. The same age Mira would have been. He thought about the stones on windowsills in every place they had ever lived. Small, unusual stones from everywhere she went, collected with a specificity that he had always assumed was just Mira being Mira. One of her particular beautiful habits, one of the many small ceremonies she had conducted on behalf of a world, she paid attention to with everything she had. He thought about the fact that she had never, in 11 years together, named this village. He thought about a girl of 10 named Fenna, who brought injured animals home from the forest and kept coming back to a fox with a hurt leg and left a letter in a wall because she understood she needed to leave something behind. He sat with all of these things in the quiet of the bedroom. And the quiet was the kind of quiet that comes after something has shifted that cannot be unshifted. And he did not rush it. He did not rush it because some things need room. Downstairs, Callum had gone back outside. Rowan could see him through the bedroom window, a small figure in the last grey light at the edge of the field, and the fox at his side, and the two of them standing at the tree line, looking into the dark of the forest, together with a stillness that was not the stillness of waiting, but the stillness of having arrived. Rowan put the photograph face down on the bedside table. Then he turned it back over. He looked at his wife's young face, the way she stood at the edge of those trees, with her head turned slightly, catching something in the periphery, the way she had always caught things others missed. He thought about what kind of person she would have been at 10, at the age Callum was. Now, curious, quietly, certain. The kind of girl who found things in forests and brought them home and kept coming back to them. He pressed his fingers gently against the surface of the photograph. He said her name once, quietly, in the empty room. The Carrath Castle case was formally reopened and assigned to a detective inspector from Inverness, who spent 3 days in Ashfeld in December, interviewing the remaining residents who had known Fianna Fáil and examining the site at the gatehouse. The structural examination of the castle grounds, conducted alongside the investigation, found no evidence that Fianna had come to harm on the property itself. The prevailing conclusion, given the letter's existence and the items left behind, was that Fianna had been present at the castle on or shortly before her disappearance, that she had intentionally hidden the package, and that her disappearance had likely occurred afterward and elsewhere, possibly involving the road south of the village, where a significant storm had come through that same week. The case remained open. These cases always do. The fox was documented by a wildlife researcher named Isla Guthrie, who spent several days in Ashfeld in January, drawn by the account of an unusually habituated wild fox in the valley. She observed the fox over 4 visits and noted several things in her report that she described as the fox showed no fear response to human proximity, particularly in relation to Callum. She also noted the fox's age, which she estimated at between 8 and 12 years. She also noted the presence of what she believed to be a den site behind the fallen section of the East Tower, consistent with long-term habitation of the site. She noted these things and filed her report, and did not attempt to explain them, because she was a scientist, and what she had observed fell outside the perimeter of what science was currently equipped to explain, and she understood this, and she wrote it down. Rowan had the photograph examined by a person who specialized in dating prints. The paper composition and printing technique placed it in the range of 1992-1993. Consistent with Mira having been approximately 9 or 10 years old when it was taken, he sat with this information for a long time. He did not tell Callum. He did not tell Callum because he was not certain of anything, because certainty was not available, and might never be, and might not be the point. Because some things are not meant to be solved, only held, the way you hold a stone from someone's windowsill after they are gone, knowing that they held it too, knowing that they found it somewhere and thought it was worth keeping, not knowing what they thought when they held it, but carrying the weight of it forward anyway. He did not tell Callum, but the following spring, in March, when the days lengthened enough to justify it, Rohan began making repairs to the outer wall of Carrath Castle. He had no formal arrangement with the estate trust, but he had written them a letter that had gone unanswered for 4 months, and he had decided that silence was not a refusal. He was a forestry engineer. He knew stonework well enough for basic stabilization. He began with the gatehouse. Callum helped on weekends. The fox was present for most of it, not always visible, but present in the way that things are present when you have stopped being surprised by them. Callum had given the fox a name by then. He had named her Ember. Rohan had not suggested this name and had not commented on it when Callum announced it, but he had noted it, silently, privately, in the way he noted most of the things his son did that moved him too much to speak about. By late April, the gatehouse wall was stable. They had cleared the ground around the East Tower. They had found, behind the fallen section of that tower, exactly where the letter said to look, evidence of the din that Fianna had described. Long established, generations deep. The kind of habitation that accumulates over decades of returning, over seasons of a creature that knows where it belongs and keeps coming back to it. On a Saturday in May, Callum sat at the base of the East Tower, with Ember asleep across his feet, which she did sometimes now, and opened his green notebook and began to draw. He drew the tower. He drew the trees around the clearing. He drew the slant of morning light on old stone. He drew carefully and quietly for a long time, and then he stopped, and he looked at the page, and then he looked up at his father who was working nearby, and he said, out of nowhere, the way children say important things, as if they have been waiting for exactly the right silence to drop them into. Do you think she was happy here? Rohan set down his tools. He looked at his son. He looked at the clearing. He looked at the fox asleep across the boy's feet, with the particular weight of something that has decided to stay. He said, I think she found what she was looking for. Callum looked at him for a moment with that expression that Rohan still sometimes could not read. Then he looked back at his notebook. He drew a small fox in the margin of the page, amber and rust, with the ears slightly asymmetrical and one paw lifted. He drew it very carefully, the way you draw something you already know by heart. He drew it the way his mother used to trace the edges of maps, like he was afraid it might shift while he wasn't watching. And at the bottom of the page, in the careful block letters of a child who has been practicing, he wrote a name. Not Ember, not Faina, not his mother's name. He wrote, "Still here," and closed the notebook.